For over 2,000 years, one system of rule governed the largest population on Earth. Dynasty after dynasty rose and fell, but the idea of the emperor, the son of heaven, the one man standing between his people and the will of the gods, never disappeared. The Qing dynasty was the last of these dynasties, and for 267 years it ruled over more territory and more people than almost any empire in human history. Its emperors commanded the Forbidden City, a walled palace complex so vast that ordinary citizens spent their entire lives without ever seeing inside it. They controlled trade routes, stretching from the Pacific coast to Central Asia. They held a mandate that, in the eyes of hundreds of millions of people, came directly from heaven itself. And then, in the span of a single winter, all of it ended. Not through a foreign invasion, not through a battle, through a piece of paper signed by a woman on behalf of a 6-year-old boy who had no idea what he was losing. That boy was Puyi. He would go on to live one of the strangest lives of the entire 20th century. He would be crowned emperor before he could read. He would be expelled from his own palace as a teenager. He would be installed as a puppet ruler by a foreign army that used his name to justify an invasion. He would be captured, imprisoned, interrogated, and eventually released as an ordinary citizen, forced to learn how to tie his own shoelaces at the age of 53. Along the way, the people around him fared even worse. One empress would die alone on a prison floor, starving and hallucinating. One princess would be executed by firing squad as a spy. One prince would build an entire second life 6,000 miles away, married into the very culture that had destroyed his family's power. This is the story of what happened to China's last royal family after the empire fell, and it is one of the strangest, most tragic, and most misunderstood collapses in modern history. To understand how it ended, you need to understand how fragile it already was by the time Puyi was born. By the late 1800s, the Qing dynasty was a wounded giant. China had lost 2 opium wars to Britain, each one forcing humiliating trade concessions and the loss of territory. Japan, a country the Qing court had long viewed as inferior, defeated China decisively in 1895, seizing Taiwan and shattering the myth of Chinese military supremacy. Foreign powers carved out spheres of influence along the coast, effectively colonizing pieces of Chinese territory without ever formally declaring war. Inside the country, the Taiping Rebellion had already killed an estimated 20 million people in a civil war, fought partly in the name of a man who believed himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 saw foreign armies march into Beijing itself, and the imperial court fled the capital in disguise. Real power inside the palace belonged not to any emperor, but to Empress Dowager Cixi, a woman who had ruled from behind the throne for nearly half a century, outliving and outmaneuvering nearly every rival who challenged her. By 1908, Cixi was dying, and so was the Guangxu emperor, the nephew she had controlled for decades. In a moment that historians still debate, Guangxu died one day before Cixi did, and forensic testing conducted nearly a century later found lethal levels of arsenic in his remains. With her final acts of authority, the dying Empress Dowager named her successor, a 2-year-old boy named Puyi, the son of a Manchu prince who was pulled screaming from his family's home and installed on the dragon throne in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. He was too young to sit still through his own coronation. As the ceremony dragged on and the boy wailed in distress, his father tried to comfort him by saying it would soon be over. Court officials who overheard this exchange considered it a terrible omen. They were right. 3 years later, the empire itself was over. The Xinhai Revolution broke out in October of 1911, a wave of uprisings across the country driven by Republican reformers, disillusioned soldiers, and a population exhausted by decades of humiliation and decline. Province after province declared independence from the Qing court. General Yuan Shikai, the most powerful military figure left loyal to the dynasty, realized the throne was unsalvageable and began quietly negotiating with the revolutionaries, using his control of the military to extract the most favorable terms possible for himself. On February the 12th, 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu, the regent ruling on behalf of the 6-year-old Puyi, signed the instrument of abdication. It brought to an end not just the Qing dynasty, but more than 2,000 years of continuous imperial rule in China. The abdication document was carefully negotiated. In exchange for stepping aside, the imperial family secured something called the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Puyi would keep his title, though it now meant nothing politically. He would be allowed to remain living inside the northern half of the Forbidden City, treated with the ceremonial respect due an emperor, and paid an annual subsidy by the new Republic of China. It was, in theory, a soft landing. In practice, it was the beginning of one of the strangest childhoods any human being has ever experienced. He was told he was still emperor. His routine did not change. He was surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and imperial protocol exactly as before. The only thing missing was an empire to actually rule. For 12 years, Puyi lived in this bizarre limbo, a boy god with no kingdom, playing with a bicycle inside palace walls that no longer meant anything to the country beyond them. In 1917, a warlord loyal to the old dynasty briefly restored him to the throne in a chaotic coup that lasted exactly 12 days before collapsing under the weight of nationwide opposition. Remembered today mostly for the strange historical footnote that it produced the first aerial bombing raid in East Asian history, when a single crude bomb was dropped on the palace from a Republican biplane, causing only minor damage and considerable confusion. Puyi's tutor, a Scotsman named Reginald Johnston, gave him an English name, Henry, taught him to ride a bicycle, cut off his queue, and introduced him to Western newspapers and ideas that the rest of the palace desperately wanted him not to see. For a while, it seemed as though Puyi might simply be allowed to live out his life this way. An emperor in name only, growing old inside a museum built around him. Then, on the morning of November the 5th, 1924, everything changed in the space of 3 hours. Puyi later wrote that he was eating an apple at 9 in the morning when soldiers loyal to the warlord Feng Yuxiang arrived at the palace gates. Feng had seized control of Beijing and, looking to score political points with a Republican public that increasingly viewed the continued existence of an imperial court as an embarrassment, unilaterally canceled the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Puyi and his household were given 3 hours to vacate the only home he had ever known. 18 years old and suddenly stripped of every title and privilege, he signed a declaration that afternoon, formally abolishing what remained of his own imperial status, then left the Forbidden City in a fleet of borrowed limousines, taking with him roughly 2,000 attendants and as much of the imperial art collection as he could carry. He would never live inside those walls again. He fled first to the Japanese legation in Beijing, and from there to the Japanese-controlled concession in the port city of Tianjin, where foreign powers still operated outside Chinese jurisdiction. In Tianjin, Puyi and his wife, Wanrong, an educated, elegant young woman he had married in an arranged ceremony in 1922, lived a strange, gilded half-life. Local foreign consuls and businessmen still addressed him as Your Majesty. His birthday was celebrated with parties and formal toasts. He was courted by warlords and foreign officials who promised, one after another, that they could help restore him to the throne, each of them really only interested in what a puppet with imperial legitimacy could do for their own ambitions. It was flattering, intoxicating, and completely hollow. With no empire and no purpose, Puyi and Wanrong drifted into boredom and excess. Wanrong began smoking opium to fill the emptiness of her days, a habit that would eventually consume her entirely. Puyi, desperate to feel powerful again, grew more and more receptive to the whispers of Japanese officials who had a very specific use in mind for a dispossessed emperor with a legitimate bloodline and a bottomless need to matter again. In September of 1931, Japan engineered a pretext to invade Manchuria, the resource-rich region in China's northeast that was also the ancestral homeland of the Manchu people and the Qing dynasty itself. Within months, Japanese forces controlled the entire region and needed a way to make their occupation look less like a naked invasion and more like the restoration of a legitimate local government. Puyi was their answer. In 1932, he was secretly smuggled out of Tianjin and installed as the head of a new state called Manchukuo, first as chief executive and then, in 1934, formally crowned emperor once again. For a man who had spent 8 years mourning the loss of his throne, the offer must have felt like destiny correcting itself. It was, in reality, one of the great tragedies of his life. Puyi held no genuine power in Manchukuo. Every decision was made by Japanese military advisors who surrounded him at all times. He was not permitted to appoint his own ministers, control his own budget, or leave the country without approval. He lived in a hastily constructed modern palace, far less grand than anything he had known as a child, presiding over ceremonies as a figurehead, while Japan used his name and his bloodline to legitimize an occupation that would ultimately cost millions of Chinese lives. He had wanted to be emperor again so badly that he became a prop in someone else's empire instead. The people around him during these years suffered fates even darker than his own. His wife Wanrong, isolated and increasingly desperate inside the sterile new palace, sank deeper into opium addiction. She reportedly had an affair during this period and gave birth to a daughter that Puyi refused to acknowledge as his own. The infant was killed shortly after birth on his orders, a horror that some accounts suggest permanently shattered whatever remained of Wanrong's stability. There was also his younger brother, Puyi, who had been groomed by the Japanese military as insurance in case Puyi failed to produce an heir. In 1937, Puyi was married off to Hiro Saga, a Japanese noblewoman distantly related to the imperial family, in a union orchestrated entirely by the Kwantung Army to bind the Isen-Joro bloodline permanently to Japan. And then there was a cousin of the family, a Manchu princess born Aisin Joro Xianyu, who had been sent as a child to be raised by a Japanese adoptive father and returned to adulthood as a spy and propagandist for Japanese military intelligence, operating under the name Kawashima Yoshiko, the press calling her the Eastern Jewel. She rode horses in men's military uniforms, orchestrated intelligence operations across occupied China, and became one of the most notorious collaborators of the entire war. When Japan finally collapsed in 1945, she would pay for it with her life. That collapse came fast, and it came brutally. In August of 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria. Japanese defenses crumbled within days. Puyi, informed that his puppet empire was finished, attempted to flee toward Japan by plane, planning to abandon almost everyone around him in the process. He never made it. Soviet forces intercepted his aircraft at the airport and took him into custody, the second time in 21 years that Puyi's world had ended in the space of a single morning. He would spend the next 5 years as a prisoner of the Soviet Union, held in facilities near Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East, uncertain whether he would ever be released, tried, or simply disappear. Left behind in the chaos, Wanrong tried to flee toward Korea with her sister-in-law Hiro Saga, but the two women were captured by Chinese communist guerrilla forces in January of 1946. What followed was one of the cruelest deaths of any deposed royal in modern history. Separated from any source of opium and given almost no food, Wanrong spent her final months in a prison cell in Jilin province, writhing in the agony of withdrawal, hallucinating that she was still empress and issuing commands to guards who only laughed at her. Hirosaga, who despised what Japan and the Manchukuo regime had done to her own life, nonetheless stayed by Wanrong's side for as long as she could, feeding her, cleaning her, trying to offer some scrap of dignity to a woman the rest of the country now viewed as a symbol of everything they hated. Eventually, the two women were separated during a prisoner transfer. Wanrong was too weak to walk and was simply left behind. She died alone in her cell on June the 20th, 1946, at the age of 39, from malnutrition and opium withdrawal. Her body was never recovered. To this day, no one knows exactly where the last empress of China is buried. Kawashima Yoshiko, the Eastern Jewel, was captured soon after Japan's surrender and put on trial in China as a traitor and war collaborator. Despite claims from her defenders that she actually held Japanese citizenship and should have been tried as a prisoner of war rather than executed as a domestic traitor, Chinese courts rejected the argument. She was executed by firing squad in Beijing in March of 1948, one of the only members of the extended Isen-Joro clan to be formally put to death for her role in the Manchukuo years. For decades afterward, rumors persisted that she had somehow escaped execution and lived out her life in hiding. Rumors that speak to just how uneasily the public reconciled itself to the idea that a Manchu princess had become one of the most hated collaborators of the entire war. Puyi's own fate, held in Soviet custody, took an entirely different and stranger turn. In August of 1950, 5 years after his capture, the Soviet Union handed him over to the newly established People's Republic of China. He arrived as a war criminal, terrified that he would be executed, and reportedly attempted suicide shortly after his arrival at the facility that would define the next decade of his life, the Fushun War Criminals Management Center in Liaoning Province. What happened to him there was unlike anything any other deposed monarch in this series has ever experienced. Rather than execution, rather than quiet imprisonment, rather than exile, the Chinese Communist government chose to use Puyi as a demonstration. If the last emperor of China, the most privileged, most pampered, most politically compromised man in the entire country, could be broken down and rebuilt into a loyal citizen of the new communist state, it would be living proof that no one was beyond the reach of ideological transformation. For 9 years, Puyi underwent intense political re-education alongside dozens of other former Manchukuo and Japanese officials, including his own brother Puji. He attended endless self-criticism sessions. He was shown documentary footage of Japanese wartime atrocities in Manchuria and forced to confront the reality of what his puppet regime had enabled. He performed manual labor in the prison's vegetable garden. Guards taught him, at the age of nearly 50, how to dress himself, how to brush his teeth, and how to tie his own shoelaces, tasks he had never once performed for himself in a lifetime, spent surrounded by servants and eunuchs. On December the 4th, 1959, after 9 years of imprisonment, Puyi was granted a special pardon and released as a rehabilitated citizen of the People's Republic of China. He was 53 years old, and for the first time in his entire life, he was simply a private individual with no title, no palace, and no political significance whatsoever. He was given a job as a gardener and general handyman at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, tending flower beds and trimming hedges in the same city where he had once been carried through the streets as a living god. He later worked as a researcher and editor for a national historical archive body, and in 1962, at 56 years old, he married for a fifth and final time to a hospital nurse named Li Shuxian. Their marriage, unlike every arranged and politically engineered union before it, appears by most accounts to have been a genuinely happy one. He wrote his autobiography during and after his imprisonment, a book called From Emperor to Citizen, which the communist government promoted heavily as proof of its own capacity to transform even the most privileged remnants of the old feudal order into loyal members of the new China. When the Cultural Revolution erupted in 1966, plunging the entire country into chaos and turning ordinary citizens against anyone connected to China's old aristocratic past, Puyi should by any logic have been one of the most obvious targets imaginable. Instead, Premier Zhou Enlai personally placed him under a form of political protection, apparently viewing the rehabilitated former emperor as too valuable a propaganda symbol to sacrifice to the mob. It likely saved his life. He died just 1 year later, on October the 17th, 1967, of complications from kidney cancer, at the height of the very political chaos he had narrowly been shielded from. Hospital staff reportedly had to physically block Red Guards from entering his ward in his final hours. In keeping with communist funeral practice, his body was cremated rather than embalmed, breaking with more than 2,000 years of imperial burial tradition. His ashes were placed at a revolutionary cemetery alongside Communist Party officials, an almost unbearably strange final resting place for a man born to be buried among emperors. It was not until 1995, nearly 3 decades after his death, that his widow Li Shuxian arranged, in exchange for financial support from a private cemetery operator, to have his ashes moved to a commercial burial ground near the Western Qing tombs, close to the resting place of his predecessor, the Guangxu Emperor. He lies there today under a small marker that reads, simply, without any imperial title at all, Puyi, 1906 to 1967. His brother Puyi, spared the same imprisonment as his older sibling and released around the same time, went on to reunite with his Japanese wife Hirosaga after a 16-year separation caused by the war, thanks to the personal intervention of Premier Zhou Enlai. Their younger daughter, born in Tokyo in 1940, still lives in Japan today, the granddaughter of a Japanese noblewoman and the niece of the last emperor of China, carrying a bloodline that once claimed the mandate of heaven into an entirely ordinary modern life. Puyi himself became the formal head of the House of Eisenjiro after Puyi's death, a title with no legal power but enormous symbolic weight, a position that has since passed down through several successors and is held today by a man named Jin Yuzhang, a retired civil servant living quietly in Beijing. That surname, Jin, is the key to understanding what happened to almost the entire extended Qing imperial clan in the decades after the fall. Eisenjiro, the Manchu name of the ruling family, literally translates to Golden Clan. Rather than risk the social and political stigma of carrying an unmistakably imperial surname through decades of Republican and then communist rule, the overwhelming majority of the family quietly changed their names to Jin, the Chinese word for gold, blending seamlessly into the population of ordinary Chinese citizens. Today, there are believed to be tens of thousands of people descended from the extended Qing imperial clan living across China. The majority of them completely unaware of or entirely disconnected from their ancestry, their family history buried under 70 years of deliberate anonymity. A small number embraced their heritage more openly. The calligrapher and educator Qi Gong, one of modern China's most respected cultural figures, was in fact a direct descendant of the Qing imperial line, born Eisenjiro Qigong, though he spent much of his public life deliberately downplaying the connection. What makes the fall of the Qing dynasty so different from every other collapsed monarchy is what came afterward politically. The Ottomans were violently erased from Turkish national identity for half a century before being slowly, cautiously rehabilitated. The Romanovs were murdered outright. The Habsburgs lost their throne but kept significant private wealth and international influence. The Qing family lost everything: their palace, their wealth, their titles, and eventually even their name. And yet, the very man who had once been emperor of China ended his life as a gardener and a minor bureaucrat, publicly held up by the government that dismantled his empire as living proof of that government's own righteousness. No other fallen dynasty in modern history was so completely absorbed and repurposed by the political system that replaced it. The Qing didn't just lose their empire. They were reprogrammed by the nation that succeeded it, and then quietly folded back into the population they used to rule, as though the Golden Clan had simply dissolved into the color of an ordinary Chinese surname. There is something almost unbearably poetic in that final image. A man who was once worshipped as a living deity, unable to dress himself, unable to tie his own shoes, ending his life kneeling in a flower bed instead of on a throne. It would be easy to call it humiliation, and in many ways it was. But there is another way to see it. Puyi's story, unlike the Romanovs, who were shot in a basement, unlike Wanrong, who died alone on a cell floor, unlike his own cousin who was executed by firing squad, ends not in death, but in an almost unimaginable second act. An emperor who lived long enough to become, in his own words, simply a citizen. The forbidden city that once held him prisoner as a boy god now stands as a museum visited by millions of tourists every year, most of whom have no idea that the last person who ever legitimately called it home ended his days trimming hedges less than 10 miles away. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling the stories that history books tend to skip over. Let me know in the comments. Of everyone in this family's story, whose fate shocked you the most? I'll see you in the next one.